I've been developing this pattern on a disc-shaped bead for years now, always like altering the colors and the patterns and how I want it to look, and in my own mind's eye, striving for, I guess, something visually pleasing, or do you call it perfection? I don't know. And I really want to show you how I do that at this torch, in fact. And let me show you the process. When I'm working on a bead shaped like this one, I always make sure to pay attention to where the flame is and its direction to the bead. Primarily, I use the heat from two sides, from the left and the right, individually in order to retain the bead's disc shape. As I plan colors and think about how the colors will stretch towards the center of the bead, I'm looking to create a really fine point of color that's delicate and has this repetitive pattern, much like the petals of a flower. Before beginning, I like to prepare a few rods of glass ahead of time by folding them and attaching them to a sort of handle of glass, and I put them into the kiln to keep them warm, and this doubling over of the glass rods gives me an easy way to make a bigger gather of glass later as the bead gets larger when I'm working on it. Here I'm using a soda lime glass that has a particular ivory color that I absolutely love. It's rather a soft color to work with, and in some ways it's a tricky choice for the core of this bead, but I really choose it because of its wonderful creamy color that I want aesthetically to have in the center of the bead. And I just have to be careful as I place each layer down. I keep the bead in general rather cool so that the layers will build up and create a disc-like shape. I really like using this doubled over glass rod to make a larger gather of glass, and I can heat it up quickly and lay quite a bit of glass down all at once. And I could definitely work this way with a standard rod of glass, but having the doubled over rod just makes the work go by a tiny bit quicker. With the glass that I'm using, this ink blue is rather stiff, and I'm putting it over the ivory glass, which is much softer. Practically speaking, I'd want the inverse situation for a bead shaped like this one, but visually, I really prefer to have the ivory at the core. So I'm a little extra careful not to let the ivory glass get too hot while I'm working on the darker transparent layer over the top. And all the shaping that I do to the bead at this point is an important step in the process. I like to perfect the overall shape of the bead now prior to putting on any decoration. Here I'm using a very light pink glass, and oftentimes I'll use a light opaque color to start with. And this first row of dots is the most important row that will set up the spacing for the rest of the pattern. I always try to place the dots as carefully as I can, but I can also make sure they're exactly where I want them to be by adjusting their footprint of each dot with the thin blade of a knife. And on this particular bead, I've decided to leave a little space between this first layer in order to be able to fit a tiny dot between these larger dots. Sometimes I plan all the colors out ahead of time, and sometimes I just make decisions spontaneously while working. And I like to consider how these opaque base dots will influence the transparent colors that I'll put over them. Colors can shift slightly when they have layers, like transparent layers over different opaque colors, and I really love these really slight shifts of color. When I first started making beads, now over 30 years ago, I did not touch a dot once it was placed on the bead. I find that nowadays I kind of mess with the dots quite a bit. I want to move them around. I'll add glass, I'll take away glass. I can make them larger, I can make them smaller, and I like to shift each dot into just the place where I want it to be before, moving the design forward. I suppose at this point I could work on one side of the bead and complete all the patterning before going to the next side, but I really like to work back and forth between the two sides. Perhaps it helps me keep track of design decisions, um, but it definitely helps in keeping the bead evenly heated throughout the process. When it comes to color choices, I really like to experiment with using different colors in combination with each other um, on each side of the bead. One thing that I do find helpful thinking about color is um, knowing ahead of time which colors leave a crisp border when they're melted in, and which colors will leave, let's say, a fuzzy border when it's melted in. Um, and I like to make little color tests ahead of time on smaller work before investing a chunk of time on a larger piece. Most of the time, and for this bead in particular, um, I like to have a transparent dot of glass fully cover that base opaque. Um, I'll take time and check and double check each dot and add a little bit more glass where needed, and then work with a knife blade, almost like tucking in or patting down the transparent over the opaque wherever it's needed. When I first started making discs with these patterns, it was to use them for the jewelry that I was making at the time. And with the skills that I had, I could only decorate the right hand side of the bead, and I would totally leave the left hand side completely blank. But with time, I got better, and if not braver, to try to decorate what at the time was a blank side, was the left hand side of the bead. And it's interesting to me now that actually the left hand side um, decorating is much easier, and I prefer that side now as I work. Once I could successfully decorate both sides of the bead, I began using different colors on each side. And what this would give me would be a choice of colors to use for my jewelry once the bead was finished. And after all these years, I still work this way. Um, if I end up liking one side much more than another, then I'll happily grind off the one side of the bead that I don't like as much. And then if I absolutely can't decide and I love both sides of the bead, then I'll leave it and it stays as its own little individual bead in the world. When I'm happy with the layers of dots at this point, I'll heat the whole bead as uniformly as I can and slowly melt the dots in. And I take care not to heat the bead too much because I don't want to lose this disc shape. Too much heat will give me a round bead, albeit nice to have a round bead, but I'm really striving for that disc shape. So I'm very careful about where the flame hits the bead in this process. At this point, I'll take a minute to think about the colors, and then sometimes I'll add a little extra dot of a different color over the dots that are on the bead in order to give them a little bit more depth. And what I like to describe is maybe a richness in color. I think of it as almost like using watercolors and mixing pigments together in order to get an effect that you just can't get from using one single color. Once all the colors are placed where I want them and they're slightly melted in, I'll get my tool ready that I'm going to use to pick the design. And ideally, I would have sharpened my pick ahead of time. This one that I'm going to use is sharp, but I really want a very, very sharp point. So oftentimes when I'm working, I'll take a second and give it a little hit with a file in order to make sure that that point is extra sharp. I tend to call this technique picking because of the action that I do. It's not really a drag or pull, or some people call it feathering, but because of the action, I really prefer to call it picking because it's so descriptive of the movement that I'm making. And my favorite pick to use is something that I just make out of a thin stainless steel rod, and I sharpen it to a very fine point. I like it when the pick grabs the glass ever so slightly, and because I'm looking to pull the design little by little. If the pick gets too hot, then it's easy to cool it in a little bit of water, but I actually do like it to be slightly warm because of that sticking and grabbing and pulling of the glass that I'm after. I tend to alternate picking dots that are distant from each other, almost as if I'm sort of jumping around the surface of the bead, and I definitely don't work in a clockwise or a counterclockwise direction, and I think that's because I really don't want heat to concentrate in any one location because that will distort the pattern that I'm after. And another reason is it's a nice way to keep the bead entirely warm, while I'm working on it, and to avoid the bead getting too cold, which could risk it cracking. A pattern bead this size on a 6mm mandrel typically takes me well over an hour to make, and I've edited out all the heating and the reheating time in the process for this video, but I really wanted you to know the real time that it takes to make a piece like this. And I find that working the glass when it is really stiff and it's hot, but it seems like it's sort of cold when I'm working on it. It it helps me move in sort of precise, thoughtful ways, and it's slow for sure, but slow seems to make me very happy. Um, I love the suspended feeling that I get while working, and watching the design develop um, is super satisfying. I've worked on developing this specific floral pattern over time, and at first I was trying to merge two separate patterns that I was making in very different beads, and picking seemed to be the best solution. I had never worked with a pick before, um, and this floral design slowly grew out of that experiment, um, and it began to solidify in my mind's eye. I love working um, with certain design constraints. You know, here it was the form of the disc that I loved so much, and I was trying to create patterns on the right and the left hand side. And um, I feel like experimentation, even if it's with very slight variations, can, you know, push a design and help it develop and mature over time. When I've finished all the picking that I want to do, I heat the sides of the bead, the right hand side and the left hand side, um, in order to melt the decoration. My goal at this point is to melt the decoration and the surface of the bead, yet not distort the center of the bead. So a lot of the heat is focused up on the higher part and maybe not down into the center of the bead, um, because I really want to retain that, you know, wonderful disc-like shape. And I think that the trickiest part of making a bead that has this shape is that it takes a lot of manipulation. It's not just heating up the bead and letting gravity work for you. It's I'm sort of fighting gravity and, you know, using the flame and using the graphite paddle and, you know, pushing and prodding it into the form that I want it to be. And here at the end, I really like using a few of the tiniest opaque dots that float on the surface of the larger transparent dots. And I really like using, you know, once again, a full 5 to 6 millimeter glass rod for the tiniest dots, especially on a bigger disc bead. I feel like I can get quite close to the center of the bead, and the radiant heat that is coming off of the glass and coming off of the hot mandrel will not melt the rod of glass where I don't want it to melt. And yet I can deposit the very tiniest dot off the end, just where I want it to go. Um, if the dot is lightly placed and it's not exactly where I want it to be, then I can easily pick it off with cold tweezers and start again. And I also can adjust the dots and take some off and put some on and make them bigger or smaller before I make that final decision to melt them in. Surface decoration in general has always really fascinated me, and through the years I love to study patterns from other cultures and throughout history. And I love both ancient and contemporary textiles and ceramics and architecture. I feel like they've all influenced the work that I do, and it's not that I strive to duplicate exactly what I see, but it's rather a form of, let's say, digesting um, what is seen and trying to incorporate that into then what can be made. And I like to think of it as almost developing a personal vocabulary of making. And in the end, I feel so very grateful to be part of, centuries or more of a lineage of makers in the world. And there you have the finished floral disc bead. I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if you're a glass artist, perhaps you found a few things that will help your own work. And for everyone out there, happy making.